He thought leaving quietly would protect his children. But he had no idea he was walking back into a silence that had been slowly breaking them for years. The black SUV stopped half a block away from the house that once echoed with laughter, its polished surface reflecting the late afternoon sun like nothing had changed, but everything had. Richard Hale stepped out, not in a tailored suit that commanded boardrooms, but in worn jeans and a faded gray jacket, the kind no one looked at twice, his shoulders slightly hunched, his presence deliberately small. 5 years. That was how long he had stayed away, telling himself it was necessary. That distance was the price of keeping them safe, that one day they would understand. But as he stood there now, looking at the tall iron gates and the perfectly trimmed hedges of the estate he had built for them, something inside him tightened, a quiet doubt he had been ignoring for far too long. He walked the remaining distance on foot, gravel crunching under his boots, each step slower than the last, as if the ground itself was asking him whether he was ready to see what waited inside. The guard at the gate barely glanced at him, just another maintenance worker on a routine visit, and waved him through with a dismissive flick of the wrist. Richard nodded once, saying nothing, his eyes already scanning the familiar driveway, the marble fountain, the wide front steps that used to be a racetrack for two small children chasing each other in the summer heat. The front door stood open. That alone was wrong. Inside, the house felt colder than he remembered, not in temperature, but in something harder to name, something that lingered in the air like a silence that had been sitting too long. His boots echoed softly against the marble floors, each step carrying further than it should, as if the walls themselves had nothing left to say. He paused just beyond the entryway, unseen, unheard, and that was when he heard it. "Stand up straight when I'm talking to you." The voice was sharp, controlled, carrying the kind of authority that didn't belong to someone who was supposed to care. Richard's gaze shifted toward the living room, where the afternoon light cut through tall windows, illuminating a scene he wasn't prepared for. Ethan stood near the center of the room, shoulders stiff, his hands clenched at his sides, trying to look older than he was, trying not to show whatever it was he was feeling. Across from him stood Mrs. Carter, perfectly dressed, posture rigid, her expression tight with impatience rather than concern. "I asked you a simple question," she continued, her tone clipped, each word landing like a quiet command. "Why were you late to your lesson?" Ethan swallowed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was helping Lily." A pause followed. Not a kind one. The kind that made the air feel heavier. Mrs. Carter exhaled slowly, shaking her head as if disappointed in something far greater than a child's answer. "Helping your sister is not your responsibility. Discipline is." The room went still. Richard didn't move. Couldn't. His fingers curled slightly at his sides, the faintest tremor running through them as something cold and unfamiliar settled in his chest. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. This wasn't what he had left them for. And in that moment, standing in the shadow of his own home, Richard Hale realized he hadn't just been gone. He had been replaced. Richard remained in the shadows, his presence swallowed by the tall walls and polished stone that once felt like home, but now felt like a place he no longer recognized. And as he watched Ethan lower his gaze under Mrs. Carter's scrutiny, something deeper than anger settled inside him, something quieter and far more dangerous, because it came with understanding. This was not a single moment. This was routine. Across the room, Lily sat at the edge of a cream-colored sofa, her small hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor as if she had learned that looking up only made things worse. And Richard noticed the way she barely moved, barely breathed, as though even existing too loudly might invite correction. "Look at me when I speak to you," Mrs. Carter said again, her voice calm but firm, the kind of calm that did not comfort, only controlled, and Ethan slowly raised his eyes, forcing himself to meet hers, even as his shoulders remained tense. Richard remembered those shoulders once carrying toy airplanes, once running through sprinklers in the backyard, once laughing without hesitation, and the contrast struck him harder than any accusation ever could. "You are not here to make decisions," Mrs. Carter continued, taking a measured step closer, her heels clicking softly against the marble, each sound echoing just enough to fill the silence that no one dared to break. "Your father placed this household under my supervision for a reason. Discipline creates success. Disobedience creates failure." The words hung in the air, polished and precise, but empty of warmth, and Richard felt the weight of them settle into the room like something permanent. He had said something similar once, years ago, in a different tone, in a different context, believing structure would protect his children from a world that demanded too much. But standing there now, he saw how easily structure had been twisted into control. Ethan nodded once, a small, practiced motion, and whispered, "Yes, ma'am," the words sounding less like agreement and more like surrender, and Lily mirrored him a second later, her voice even softer, almost lost entirely. The room went still again. No laughter, no movement, only compliance. Richard's jaw tightened, but he did not step forward, not yet, because something told him that what he had just witnessed was only the surface, only the part that happened in the open. Mrs. Carter turned away from them with a quiet exhale, as if their obedience had restored balance, and adjusted the sleeve of her blazer with deliberate precision. "Dinner will be served at 6 sharp," she said, not looking back. "I expect both of you to be presentable and punctual. No excuses." She walked past Richard without noticing him, her perfume lingering briefly in the air, sharp and controlled just like her voice, and disappeared down the hallway, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. Ethan did not move right away. Neither did Lily. It was as if they were waiting for permission that was no longer being given, and after a few seconds, Ethan finally let out a slow breath, his posture collapsing just slightly, the smallest crack in the composure he had been forced to maintain. "Are you okay?" he asked Lily quietly, his voice changing the moment Mrs. Carter was gone, softer, more like the boy Richard remembered. Lily nodded, though her eyes remained downcast. "I am fine," she said, but the words came too quickly, too rehearsed, and Richard knew that tone. He had heard it in boardrooms, in negotiations, in people who had learned to say the right thing instead of the true thing. And in that moment, standing just a few feet away from his own children who did not know he was there, Richard Hale understood something he had refused to see for years. They had not been protected. They had been managed. And the difference had cost them more than he had ever intended. Richard did not step forward, not yet, because something deeper held him in place, something that demanded he see everything before he acted. And as Ethan gently reached for Lily's hand, guiding her toward the staircase with quiet care, Richard followed at a distance, his footsteps measured, silent, almost hesitant, as if he were walking through a life that no longer belonged to him. The hallway stretched long and immaculate, framed with family portraits that told a version of the past that now felt incomplete, frozen smiles captured in perfect lighting while the present had shifted into something colder, something unseen. Ethan paused at the base of the stairs, glancing over his shoulder not out of fear, but habit, as if checking whether he was being watched, and only when he seemed certain they were alone did he lean slightly closer to Lily. "You do not have to agree with everything she says," he whispered, his voice barely audible, yet filled with a quiet determination that had not been there moments before. Lily shook her head quickly, her fingers tightening around his sleeve. "We are supposed to," she replied, her voice trembling just enough to betray what she could not fully say, and Richard felt something shift inside him again, not anger this time, but something heavier, something closer to regret. They continued upstairs, their movements careful, almost rehearsed, and Richard followed just far enough to remain unseen, his eyes taking in every detail, every hesitation, every silence that spoke louder than words ever could. The second floor felt even quieter than the first, the kind of quiet that did not come from peace, but from absence, and as the children entered their rooms, leaving the door slightly open, Richard stopped in the hallway, his gaze lingering on the spaces that should have been filled with noise, with music, with the chaos of growing up, but instead felt controlled, measured, contained. From Lily's room, he heard the soft rustle of fabric, drawers opening and closing, the small, careful sounds of someone trying not to disturb anything. And then her voice, quieter now, almost uncertain. "Do you think Dad is coming back?" The question hung in the air, fragile and unguarded. And for the first time since entering the house, Richard felt his breath catch, his entire body stilling, as if the answer mattered more than anything else in that moment. Ethan did not respond right away. Richard could hear the faint creak of the floor as he shifted his weight, the pause stretching longer than it should have, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a steadiness that did not quite match the weight of the question. "He will," Ethan said, though there was a subtle strain beneath the words, something practiced, something repeated more than believed. "He always said he would." Lily was quiet for a moment, and then, almost in a whisper, she asked, "Then why hasn't he?" The room fell silent. Completely silent. Even the air seemed to stop moving, as if the house itself was waiting for an answer that did not come. Richard closed his eyes briefly, the question landing deeper than any accusation ever could, because it did not come from anger. It came from absence, from years of waiting without explanation. He opened his eyes again slowly, his gaze steady now, but changed, the hesitation that had held him back beginning to fade, replaced by something more certain, more resolved. Downstairs, a sharp voice cut through the silence once more. "Children, I expect you ready in 10 minutes. Mrs. Carter's tone carried upward through the house, controlled and precise, reclaiming the space that had briefly belonged to something softer. Ethan straightened immediately, the brief moment of vulnerability disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. "We should get ready," he said, his voice returning to that careful, measured tone. Lily nodded again, though slower this time, and Richard watched as they moved, not like children preparing for dinner, but like individuals following instructions they had learned not to question. And in that moment, standing alone in the hallway of the home he had built, Richard Hale understood something with absolute clarity. This was no longer about observing. This was about what he was going to do next. Richard moved before he allowed himself to think any further, his steps no longer hesitant but deliberate, controlled, the quiet authority he had once carried. Returning not in force, but in presence. And as he descended the staircase, each step echoed just enough to announce that someone new had entered the rhythm of the house, though no one yet understood who he was. The dining room was already prepared, the long oak table set with precision, silverware aligned perfectly, glasses catching the warm glow of the chandelier above, everything arranged to reflect order, discipline, and control rather than comfort. Mrs. Carter stood near the head of the table, reviewing a small notebook in her hand, her posture straight, her expression composed, the image of authority firmly in place. And as Richard stepped into the doorway, she glanced up briefly, her eyes scanning him with quick dismissal before returning to her notes. "You are late," she said without looking up again, her tone flat, assuming compliance before understanding. Richard did not respond immediately. Instead, he took a few steps into the room, his gaze shifting toward the two chairs halfway down the table where Ethan and Lily now sat, their backs straight, their hands resting neatly beside their plates, waiting, always waiting. Neither of them looked at him, not because they did not notice him, but because they had learned not to. "I said you are late," Mrs. Carter repeated, this time lifting her head fully, her eyes narrowing slightly as she assessed him more carefully, irritation flickering beneath her composed exterior. "Staff is expected to follow the schedule. If you cannot manage that, you will be replaced." The words landed sharply in the quiet room, and for a brief moment, no one moved. Richard felt the weight of them, not because they were directed at him, but because of how easily they were spoken in front of his children, as if this tone, this authority, had become normal, accepted, unquestioned. He glanced once more at Ethan, who kept his gaze forward, expression neutral, but his fingers tightened slightly against the table, the smallest sign that he had heard, that he understood more than he showed. Richard exhaled slowly, his voice calm when it finally came. "I will keep that in mind," he said, his tone measured, giving nothing away, and for a fraction of a second, Mrs. Carter seemed almost satisfied, as if the expected response had restored the balance she controlled so carefully. She nodded once and closed her notebook. "Good," she replied, stepping toward her seat at the head of the table. "Now let us proceed without further disruption." Dinner was served in silence, each movement precise, each gesture controlled, the clink of silverware the only sound that dared fill the space, and Richard observed everything. The way Ethan waited before taking a bite, the way Lily mirrored him, the way both of them seemed to measure their actions against an invisible standard that no child should have to carry. Halfway through the meal, Lily reached for her glass a second too early, her hand moving just slightly out of sync with the rhythm that had been imposed on them, and it was enough. "Lily, Mrs. Carter said sharply, her voice cutting through the room like a line drawn in stone. What did we discuss about timing? Lily froze instantly, her hand hovering just above the glass, her eyes dropping as if the mistake carried more weight than it should. I am sorry, she whispered, pulling her hand back slowly, her shoulders tightening. The room went silent again. Completely silent. Richard felt it this time, not just as an observer, but as a father, the kind of silence that did not teach, but suppressed, and something inside him shifted from control to certainty. He set his fork down gently, the soft sound enough to draw Mrs. Carter's attention once more, and when she looked at him, there was a brief pause, a subtle change in the air, as if something unspoken had just entered the room. Richard met her gaze steadily, not with anger, not yet, but with something far more unsettling. Recognition. And for the first time since he had walked into his own home, Richard Hale was no longer invisible. Mrs. Carter held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to place something she could not quite identify. But instead of recognition, she found only resistance, something subtle yet unmistakable, and it unsettled her just enough to shift her tone. Is there something you would like to say? She asked, her voice still controlled, but no longer entirely dismissive. Richard did not answer immediately. He allowed the silence to stretch, not as defiance, but as presence, the kind that could not be ignored. And in that quiet, even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed louder than before. Ethan glanced up for the first time, just briefly, his eyes flickering between Richard and Mrs. Carter, sensing the shift without fully understanding it. While Lily remained still, her hands now folded tightly in her lap, waiting for the moment to pass like she had learned to do. Richard finally spoke, his voice even, calm, but carrying a weight that did not belong to someone in a worn gray jacket. Children learn timing from guidance, he said, his words measured, each one deliberate. Not from fear. The room froze. Completely. Mrs. Carter's expression hardened, the faintest trace of irritation sharpening her features as she straightened slightly in her chair. Excuse me, she replied, her tone no longer neutral, but edged with authority that expected immediate correction. Richard did not look away. Correcting a child is not the same as controlling them, he continued, his voice steady, unraised, but impossible to dismiss. There is a difference. Ethan's breath caught almost imperceptibly, his posture shifting just enough to reveal that he was listening now, truly listening. While Lily's eyes lifted for the first time, drawn not by instruction, but by something unfamiliar, something that felt closer to safety than control. Mrs. Carter set her fork down with precise care, the soft clink echoing louder than it should have. You are speaking out of place, she said firmly. Your role here does not include commentary. It includes obedience. The words were sharp, but they did not land the way they had before, not with the same unquestioned authority, because something in the room had already changed. Richard leaned back slightly, not retreating, but grounding himself, his gaze unwavering. Authority without understanding creates distance, he said quietly. Not discipline. Another silence followed, heavier than any before it, and this time, it did not belong to Mrs. Carter. It belonged to him. For a moment, she did not respond. Her composure remained, but there was a crack now, something small but undeniable, because for the first time since she had taken control of the household, someone had not only challenged her, but done so without raising their voice, without breaking composure, without giving her anything she could easily dismiss. If you have concerns, she said finally, her tone tightening slightly, you may direct them to me privately, not in front of the children. Richard's expression did not change. They are the concern, he replied simply. The words settled into the room with a quiet finality, and no one moved. Ethan's eyes widened just slightly, the restraint he had been holding on to beginning to loosen, while Lily's grip on her own hands eased, just a fraction, as if something unseen had shifted in her favor. Mrs. Carter stood slowly, her chair sliding back with controlled precision, her posture rigid once more as she reclaimed the space she believed was hers. Dinner is over, she announced, her voice firm, leaving no room for discussion. Ethan, Lily, you will return to your rooms. The children obeyed immediately, rising from their seats with practiced discipline. But this time, as Ethan passed Richard, he hesitated for half a second, just enough to glance at him. Confusion and something else in his eyes, something that had not been there before. Recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of it. Lily followed, her steps quieter, but slower, as if she, too, felt the shift she could not yet explain. The room emptied, leaving only Richard and Mrs. Carter standing across from each other, the distance between them no longer defined by position, but by truth. And for the first time, she spoke without complete certainty. "Who are you?" she asked. Richard did not answer. Not yet, because some truths, once spoken, do not just change a room. They change everything. Mrs. Carter studied him carefully now, no longer with dismissal, but with calculation, as if she were trying to measure a presence that did not match the role he appeared to play, and Richard stood there without shifting, without softening, allowing the silence to stretch until it began to press against her certainty. "I asked you a question," she said again, her tone sharper this time, though beneath it was something new, something less stable. "Who are you?" Richard took a slow breath, not out of hesitation, but control, the kind that came from years of making decisions that affected entire rooms, entire companies, entire lives, and when he spoke, his voice carried that same quiet authority. "Someone who should have been here sooner," he said. The answer did not satisfy her. It unsettled her. Mrs. Carter's posture stiffened slightly, her chin lifting as she tried to reassert the structure she had built so carefully. "If you are implying negligence," she replied, her words precise, "you should be very careful. This household has functioned efficiently under my supervision." Richard's gaze did not waver. "Efficiently," he repeated, the word landing with quiet weight, not as agreement, but as observation, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The chandelier above cast a steady light across the table, illuminating every detail, every controlled expression, every subtle shift, and in that stillness, the difference between control and care became impossible to ignore. "You were not hired to replace a father," Richard continued, his voice calm, but firmer now, each word more defined than the last. Mrs. Carter's eyes narrowed immediately. "I was hired to maintain order," she replied, "and I have done exactly that." Richard took a single step forward, not aggressive, but intentional, closing just enough distance to make his presence undeniable. "Order without presence creates distance," he said, "and distance creates silence." The words settled into the room with a clarity that did not require emphasis, and for the first time, Mrs. Carter did not interrupt. She held his gaze, her expression composed, but her silence spoke of something shifting beneath the surface. "You are overstepping," she said finally, though the certainty in her voice had softened, just slightly. "This is not your place." Richard let that sit for a moment. Not reacting, not correcting, just allowing it to exist between them before answering. "That depends on what you believe this place is," he replied. Upstairs, a faint sound echoed through the hallway, the soft creak of a door, followed by the lightest movement, careful, hesitant, and though neither of them turned, both of them heard it. The children were listening. Mrs. Carter's eyes flickered for a fraction of a second, not toward the sound, but toward the realization that whatever was happening in this room was no longer contained. "You will leave," she said, her voice tightening again as she reached for the authority she had relied on for years. "I will not have disruptions in this household." Richard did not move. Not an inch. "This household was never meant to feel like this," he said quietly. "And that is the disruption." The room fell silent again. Completely silent. Even the faint hum from earlier seemed to disappear, replaced by something heavier, something more final. Mrs. Carter's composure held, but just barely now, her certainty no longer unshaken, her control no longer absolute. And in that moment, something became clear not just to her, but to anyone who could feel the shift in the air. This was no longer a conversation about roles. It was about ownership. And as Richard Hale stood there, steady, unyielding, no longer hidden by silence or disguise, the truth was no longer waiting to be revealed. It was already beginning to take shape. Mrs. Carter straightened fully now, as if the invisible line she had drawn around her authority had just been crossed, and for the first time, there was no hesitation in her response, only decision. "I will not repeat myself," she said, her voice colder than before, stripped of any attempt at politeness. "You will leave this house immediately, or I will have security escort you out." The words were firm, deliberate, and meant to end the moment entirely, but they did not land the way she expected. Richard did not move. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked at her, and in that look was something she could not command, something she could not dismiss, something that made the silence stretch longer than it should. Upstairs, the faint creak returned, slightly louder this time, followed by the softest whisper of movement near the top of the staircase, and though neither of them turned, the awareness of it shifted the air again. They were not alone anymore. Mrs. Carter took a step forward, her heels striking the marble with sharper precision, reclaiming control through movement. "You are no longer welcome here," she continued, her tone tightening with each word. "This is a private residence, and you have exceeded your role." Richard's gaze remained steady, but there was a change now, subtle yet undeniable, as if something within him had reached its limit, not in anger, but in restraint. "You believe this is your authority to give," he said quietly, and the calm in his voice did more than any raised tone ever could. It unsettled her. Mrs. Carter paused, just for a fraction of a second, before responding. "It is my responsibility to maintain order here," she replied, though the words carried less certainty than before. "And I will not allow disruption from someone who does not belong." Richard let that sentence settle fully into the room, every word of it, before he moved, just one step forward, enough to close the distance between them in a way that made avoidance impossible. "Does not belong," he repeated, not questioning, not challenging, simply stating it back as if weighing its meaning. Behind him, at the edge of the staircase, two small figures now stood partially visible, silent, still, drawn by something they could not yet name, but could no longer ignore. Ethan's hand rested lightly against the banister, his grip tighter than necessary, while Lily stood just behind him, her eyes fixed on the scene below, wide with a mixture of uncertainty and something else beginning to form. Recognition. Mrs. Carter noticed them then, her posture shifting instantly as she turned her head slightly, her expression tightening, not with concern, but with awareness that the moment had expanded beyond her control. "You should not be here," she said sharply, though her voice did not carry the same authority it once did. "Return to your rooms immediately." Neither of them moved. The room held its breath. Richard turned slowly, not fully, just enough to see them, his eyes meeting Ethan's first, and for a moment, everything else faded. The house, the tension, the distance of years collapsing into something fragile and immediate. Ethan's expression shifted, confusion giving way to something deeper, something instinctive, as if a part of him recognized what his mind had not yet confirmed. Lily took a small step forward, barely noticeable, but enough to break the stillness. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling just slightly. "Who is he?" The question lingered in the air, soft, uncertain, yet powerful enough to change everything. Richard turned back toward Mrs. Carter, his posture no longer that of a man observing, but of someone who had decided. "You are right about one thing," he said, his voice calm, but final. "This is a private residence." He paused, just long enough for the weight of his next words to settle before they were even spoken. "Mine." The room went completely silent, the kind of silence that does not pass, but stays, and in that moment, everything Mrs. Carter believed she controlled began to slip, not dramatically, not loudly, but unmistakably. The word did not echo, but it did not need to, because its weight filled the room instantly, pressing against every surface, every breath, every assumption that had been built over the past 5 years, and for a moment, no one moved. Not Mrs. Carter, not the children, not even the air itself. Mrs. Carter's expression shifted first. Not dramatically, but subtly, the kind of change that revealed something breaking beneath control, her eyes narrowing, as if she were recalculating everything she thought she understood. "That is not possible," she said, her voice steady on the surface, but carrying a thin edge of disbelief. Richard did not respond immediately. He did not need to defend the truth. He simply reached into the inside pocket of his worn jacket, his movements slow, deliberate, giving the moment time to unfold, and when he pulled out a simple leather wallet, worn at the edges but unmistakably refined, he opened it just enough to reveal a familiar identification, one that carried a name that had not been spoken in this house the way it should have been. Mrs. Carter's eyes flicked downward for only a second, but it was enough. Enough for recognition to replace doubt. Enough for certainty to crack. The room went silent again. Completely silent. Upstairs, Ethan's grip on the banister tightened as his breath caught, his eyes shifting between the man below and the memory he had carried for years, trying to reconcile the two, while Lily took another small step forward, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Dad." The word was soft, uncertain, fragile, but it changed everything. Richard lifted his gaze toward them, and for the first time since he had entered the house, the composure in his expression softened, not into weakness, but into something real, something that had been held back for too long. "I am here," he said quietly. No explanation. No justification. Just presence. Ethan did not move right away. The hesitation lingered, years of distance and unanswered questions holding him in place. But then, slowly, he stepped down one stair, then another, his eyes never leaving Richard, as if each step required trust he was not sure he still had. Lily followed, quicker this time, drawn not by certainty, but by something instinctive, something that had never fully disappeared. Mrs. Carter stepped back slightly, her posture no longer centered, her authority no longer anchoring the room the way it had before. "Mr. Hale," she said, the name now carrying a different weight, her tone shifting from command to something closer to defense. "I was under the impression that your absence required structured management." Richard turned his attention back to her, his expression calm, but no longer distant. "Absence does not authorize replacement," he replied. The words were quiet, but final. Mrs. Carter straightened again, attempting to recover what had already begun to slip away. "Everything I have done has been in the interest of discipline and success," she said, her voice firm, though no longer unshaken. "Your children are well behaved, well structured, and properly guided." Richard glanced briefly toward Ethan and Lily, now standing just a few feet away, close enough to see, close enough to feel, but still unsure, still waiting, and then he looked back at Mrs. Carter. "They are silent," he said. Another pause followed, one that did not need to be filled. Mrs. Carter opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came immediately, because for the first time, the truth she had avoided was no longer abstract. It was standing in front of her, and behind her, and beside her, and in that moment, the structure she had built no longer looked like strength. It looked like something else entirely, and she knew it. The silence did not break all at once. It softened, slowly, carefully, as if the house itself was learning how to breathe again, and Richard stood there, not as a figure of authority, but as a presence that had finally returned, one that no longer needed to be hidden or explained. Ethan took another step forward, then another, until the distance between them was no longer defined by space, but by everything that had not been said, his eyes searching, questioning, and yet holding on to something that had never fully disappeared. "You said you would come back," he said, his voice steady, but carrying a weight that no child should have had to carry alone. Richard did not look away. "I should have come back sooner," he replied, and there was no defense in his words, no justification, only truth. Lily moved next, closing the remaining space with small, uncertain steps before stopping just in front of him, her eyes lifting fully now, no longer avoiding, no longer waiting for permission. "Are you staying?" she asked softly. The question hung in the air, simple, but more important than anything else that had been said that day. Richard knelt slightly, lowering himself to her level, not out of weakness, but out of intention, meeting her gaze with quiet certainty. "Yes," he said. No hesitation, no condition, just presence. And something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. Ethan exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time since Richard had walked through the door, while Lily stepped closer without thinking, her small hand reaching for his sleeve, as if confirming he was real, that he would not disappear again. Behind them, Mrs. Carter remained still, her posture no longer rigid, her authority no longer central, as the space she once controlled reshaped itself without her direction. Richard rose slowly, his attention turning back to her, but the tone had changed now, not confrontational, not defensive, but resolved. "You were hired to support this family," he said calmly, "not to replace it." Mrs. Carter opened her mouth as if to respond, but stopped, the words no longer forming as easily as they once had, because the structure she had relied on was no longer unquestioned. I followed the expectations given to me, she said finally, though her voice lacked the certainty it once carried. Richard nodded once, acknowledging the statement without accepting it fully. And now those expectations have changed, he replied. The words were simple, but final. No raised voice. No dramatic gesture. Just clarity. The room held still for a moment longer, and then Mrs. Carter lowered her gaze slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition, the kind that comes when control is replaced by truth. She stepped back, just once, creating space where she had once taken it, and in that small movement, everything became clear. This house no longer belonged to structure. It belonged to presence, to choice, to something that could not be managed. Ethan glanced between them, then back at Richard, his voice quieter now, but no longer guarded. Things felt different, he admitted. We just got used to it. Richard looked at him, really looked at him, and nodded slowly. That ends now, he said. Not as a promise. As a decision. Lily tightened her grip slightly, her expression softening in a way it had not before, the tension that once defined her posture beginning to fade. The light in the room felt warmer somehow, not because anything had changed physically, but because something invisible had lifted. The house was still the same. The walls, the floors, the silence. But the meaning had shifted. And as Richard Hale stood there with his children beside him, no longer hidden, no longer absent, the truth settled quietly into place. Respect was never built through control. It was built through presence. And that day, the silence that once filled the house was replaced by something far more powerful. It was replaced by being seen.